Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I am a criminologist by background, but my research is really focused on social norms, both compliance and deviance, in addition to legally defined crime, both its consequences and its antecedents. While my research has explored different types of crime and deviance, broadly, and also pro-social actions, the broad perspective underpinning my research is really a place-based approach. So broadly, my research considers the role of place in daily life and the extent to which people-place interactions and people-people interactions in places shape behavioural and social norms and social outcomes for individuals and for communities. So whether considering identity theory from a sociological perspective or social identity theory from a psychological perspective, place is intrinsic in facilitating the primary mechanisms through which identity is hypothesized to develop. While many may think mainly of place-based identity, specifically when we think about place and identity, really the role of place is far more wide-reaching. Indeed, place is implicit in all social processes by acting as a facilitator for exposure, encounter, and interaction, and providing the stage on which all social events and activity actually occur. Many social categories are indeed linked to places. Moreover, mobility through places, or indeed immobility and spatial constraints, influence exposures to otherness or sameness that actually then influence self-categorization. Now, while some scholars have actually started to say that our move towards a virtual world has established some level of placelessness, I would argue that this has just increased the complexity of the role of place, because now there is this dynamic of two identities, an online and an offline identity operating or place, because you're in an offline place and an online place operating together simultaneously. But rather than speak more about the role of place and the theoretical and conceptual arguments about its centrality in identity and social processes, what I'm going to do now is just move through some of the research I've been doing over the last couple of years that examines regular daily activity and regular daily life, which is really, I think, laying the groundwork for understanding the way in which social norms, social identity is informed by the things that we do every day. So while the work I'm going to present here isn't explicitly examining place-based identity, collectively, it steps out the preliminary groundwork for the work I'm doing currently, which endeavours to unpack the phenomena of the familiar stranger. Some of you may have heard of this. It's getting at the idea where individuals repeatedly encounter each other, but may never actually interact. So there may be visual recognition because they're in the same place at the same time, repeatedly, but and what this phenomena might mean as a unique social relation for both individuals and as a collective. I hypothesize that this will have meaning in terms of reduced perceptions of anonymity, increased moral obligation to obey social norms, and also feelings of responsibility, familiarity, in those places where people recognize each other. This is something that I'm doing, that I'm furthering at the moment to explore in my research. So without further ado, I'm going to start moving through the presentation. So to begin with, when we think about daily life and the regularities, this is sort of what we do each day. And we have to start thinking pre-COVID, when we used to sort of take on this sort of morning routine. So I want everyone to sort of think about what they do in the morning. You get up, you sort of leave home, either on public transport or by car. You might, go by the bus station, drop off the kids, go to the car park or grab a cup of coffee, and then walk up to the office. Now, up until this point, or relatively recently, we didn't really know much about daily life in motion, largely because we relied on travel surveys where people would report their intended activity. I was at home at this time, I was at work at this time. But so much happens on the in-between. So what we know is that the chances for daily routines between individuals to overlap actually happens between places. So this happens when you're parking the car, when you're walking to the office, when you're dropping the kids at school. And this is where we interact with other individuals and with places. And this is where pro-social interactions, but also where deviance can occur. So one of the benefits of big data is it's starting to allow us to actually examine daily life in motion and these opportunity windows that slide open temporarily throughout the day as a consequence of overlapping space-time routines of people in places through regularity. So every day you catch the same bus, you see the same people, your time-space patterns overlap. So the first part of really understanding this is to then look at individual daily life patterns. So this was the first part of unpacking this puzzle empirically, but we needed to have a theoretical framework to really base this on. So there are two key crime theories that this approach is based on: routine activities theory and crime pattern theory. Routine activities theory is based on the idea that everyday crime and disorder is largely opportunistic. So it's based on the idea that as we all go about our daily business, going to work, dropping the kids at school, going to the gym, during that time, motivated offenders and suitable victims will cross over. Our paths will cross over. And if there's no capable guardian or suitable guardian in place, there is an opportunity for a crime to occur. So basically, routine activities theory says people don't really go out of their way to commit crimes. It's more just that opportunities present themselves and people, if the benefits outweigh the risks, people take up that opportunity. Crime pattern theory similarly suggests that within people's activity space, they do take up these opportunities for crime. However, they suggest that this theory suggests that particular locales or particular nodes or land uses are more likely to be associated with opportunities because they attract the crossover of lots of activity spaces. So unlike residential streets, where we don't really seem to interact or cross over with other people that often, places with scheduled events like transport stations where everyone has to arrive at the same time, they present a lot of opportunities for the crossover of activity spaces, and therefore crime events to occur where offenders and victims come into contact. The thing about these theories is they're based on an assumption that people encounter each other. However, because we were always relying on time diaries, this idea of the encounter was never actually empirically tested. It's always been assumed. So my colleague and I have been starting to really unpack this idea of what people do in their daily life and where these encounters could possibly occur. So in this first study, we actually developed an app, a phone app called Wander, and we followed people for 2 weeks. For privacy reasons, the three I've got up here on the screen are actually my two colleagues and I. I'm boring participant number 2, and I realised after the 2 weeks that we did this that I had a very boring life and would be very easy to stalk, because I only went to 3 places in 2 weeks. But what we did, discovered from this project was that indeed, just as suggested by routine activities theory, people's lives were very much routine and habitual. And at certain times of the day, and certainly on a regular basis, people frequented not only the same nodes, but the very same pathways. So this meant that people had a small number of places that they visited that they were highly familiar with. And these varied in size and constraints across our sample, but certainly people's experiences of place were very much individualized to their own activity space, rather than being around something like a neighborhood, which is what we've sort of thought about in the past when we've tried to think about what places people identify with. So moving on from this, we started to think about, okay, what about people's perceptions of place then? How is this affected by their own activity space and the place around where they live? So we asked people about their perceptions of safety, their perceptions of police, and their awareness of crime by looking at their neighborhood, but then by looking also at their residential proximity to actual crime events. And this really further supported our ideas from the previous study that it was really people had very heterogeneous experiences of place and space, and that it was really a few places that they frequented that really was, and that they were exposed to, that was really impacting on their perceptions and their perceptions of place, and then their feelings around safety and crime and how they interacted with place and other people. So drawing on these first two pieces of information and our theoretical perspectives, we realised that yes, crime was largely opportunistic, or the chances of being involved in crime, and individual activity spaces were definitely largely routine. People were doing the same thing for weeks on end, day after day. And this definitely affected people's propensity to be involved in a crime event or in the space where a crime event occurred. So we realised that this was predicting whether people were going to be there when a crime event occurred, but it wasn't able to tell us whether what their role would be in that crime event. Would they be an offender, a victim, or a guardian? So to get more at this idea, we had to establish where, when, and who with this event was occurring. And this is really where the idea of place attachment, the relevance of that place, and then the meaning of that place or the identity associated with that place comes into play. So the first thing we started to explore a little bit more was places. So we started to think about places and the way that places themselves actually have meaning and have routine in a daily life. So first of all, we started to think about places nested within spaces. So the way in which some places, for example, we can see here, there is, with all the green spaces here, the green patterns, they're all residential blocks. The yellow spaces are parks. So you can see a park amongst all residential blocks might have quite a different meaning than on the other side where you see a store amongst residential blocks, but then surrounded by mixed land use. So those other pink blocks are more stores and commercial buildings, and then large parts of parks around. So you can see that a place is within spaces. So when we have to think about the risk or what's happening in those residential areas, it's going to be quite different because their context is different. We also had to think about daily life at places. So places are open and closed at different times. They also bring or attract people and different types of people at different times of the day. So this provides opportunities for pro-social and then deviant activities at different times of the day. Certainly, different norms might even be appropriate at different times of the day or night. For example, a place like the Fortitude Valley might have very different social norms and different definitions of deviance during the day versus a Friday or Saturday night where it becomes an entertainment precinct. So here we were mapping out where crime peaks in different types of commercial precincts. So we were looking at commercial precincts here that had different types of opening and closing hours, and also were set in different types of demographic areas to see when crime was peaking, whether that be on a weekend or whether it be during a weekday. And we were looking at what types of land use were there and what type of population was there. And we were really trying to think now about places and about how places had routine. And we were thinking, when people are in places, what does this mean? The next step then was to bring people into place. So utilizing go-card data enabled us to really look at the number of people that were present at places and to think about whether or not more people meant more victims or more guardians in terms of the role of people in places such as transport stops. Now, at this point, we're not looking at familiarity. We're simply looking at everybody as being a person that could act as a victim or a guardian. What we found when we did this was we found that where there were more passengers, there was actually more theft. And what we garnered from this was that perhaps when there is a greater number of people, anonymity, people become anonymous in a crowd, so they can commit more things like theft from the person, pickpocketing, etc., becomes easier. However, when there were higher passengers, there was actually lower property damage. So lower damage to the property of the bus stop or to the train station, suggesting that when there are people standing around waiting, they may be guardians for property, but themselves may be a victim of crime. So we're unsure how to unpack this any further at the moment, but we're moving towards looking at familiarity in place to try and understand this a little bit better. So basically, drawing together the research so far, we realised that big data and smart data do provide an objective assessment of some of those theoretical assumptions. And they do demonstrate that people do encounter each other and routine activity spaces overlap and people encounter each other. Our findings challenged some of the previous assumptions. Firstly, that there was homogeneity within neighbourhoods and that people living in neighbourhoods somehow identified and perceived things to be the same. The second thing that it challenged was that interactions and encounters happen on residential streets. Rather, we found that interactions and encounters tend to happen around places that have scheduled activity, scheduled events, or where people go for particular things like activities. So shops, train stations, bus stops, school drop-off, these sorts of things where there is a time schedule. We also found that, there was heterogeneity across the same type of thing in terms of risk or crime pattern. So not all shops were risky at the same time of day, right? So maybe in some areas, the shops are frequented by people on their way home from work. So that might be when theft from the store is likely to occur. So it was really about thinking about this in a more nuanced manner and about people's routine activity. What this did tell us as well is that opportunity is not the whole story. So the relevance of place seems to depend on frequency, recency, and duration of visits for the person, but also the regularity. So the routine, because this impacts the potential for repeated encounters with the same individuals. Social norms are essentially built on observing others in space, encounters. Moral obligation to obey social norms, then, is possibly built through repeated encounters, loss of or perceived loss of anonymity, and shared experience of place, even if that's never actually spoken about. So I would suggest, or I'm hypothesizing, that familiarity with people and place increases attachment, feelings of shared responsibility and territoriality, and guardianship. And this is actually something I'm exploring further in my DECRA, which is I'm officially starting next week. So I'll be able to go out and survey people about these perceptions and see if this is something that is actually true or not. We have actually started to look at the phenomena of the familiar stranger, though, and see if this idea of familiarity at place can explain a little bit more about whether someone is going to be a victim or a guardian when people encounter each other at place. We've done this at train stations and bus stops simply because that's the place where we have data available that allows us to do this. So we have go-card data for all people in Queensland, which, believe me, is massive and computationally extremely difficult to look at 10-minute intervals. But what we've done is we've looked at individuals who encounter each other 2 or more times a week so we've looked at people who touch on and touch off within 10 minutes of each other at the same station. And what we've found is that where this occurs, where there is a larger number of familiar strangers at a station, there is lower crime around that area, at that station, and in the 400 meters surrounding that area. We are suggesting that this is possibly because of lack of anonymity or perceived lack of anonymity, and that this increases moral obligation to obey social norms. We need to go and explore this a little bit further, because I also believe that this may be about regularity of visits and collective experience of space that produces a sense of identification with this space and feeling of responsibility for this space. But this is something that I need to explore further and unpack a little bit further. So this is where our research is headed at the moment. You can see here where we've been exploring familiarity at Indooroopilly train station. So you'll see here, so the peaks in familiarity are really mainly around boarding times in the morning. And you can see that they peak around peak times, obviously, where everyone is the same people traveling to work, and then around school boarding time coming home. So, you know, you can imagine this when if you're a public transport user, you know, you see that same person. Has anyone seen The Commuter? It's a film. Oh, it's a great film. Liam Neeson, great film. But anyway, it's about this idea where, you know, you see the same people traveling on the train each day. But it's a really important sort of social phenomena to think about, what does this mean? Like, what does this mean if we recognize people, even if we've never formally interacted? How does this change the way we behave? And how does this make us feel? Does it make people feel safer? Does it make people feel like they shouldn't be deviant? Does it make people feel like if that person who they recognize was being assaulted or was in danger, that they would step in and act as a guardian? So these types of ideas is what I'm really fascinated in really looking at more, is how this kind of underlying unique kind of idea of a social relation is really can impact people, and if it's because of this identification with place or with people. So that's where the research is going now. So just to finish up, I guess the future directions then is really integrating this macro, micro, and individual theories of sociology and crime, and really thinking about people at places within spaces, and integrating these concepts of routine activities, familiarity, social norm diffusion, so how people learn about social norms and why we start to behave or be morally obliged to behave in a particular way, and then territoriality and guardianship, and why we start to feel protective of a space and then engage with others to sort of say, hey, you have to behave in this way too. And so these are the sort of ideas that I'm engaging with now, and I'm sort of really interested in taking into the future. So yeah, thank you.